On the 1st of November 1998, the Vice President of the United States made a phone call. He was not using a phone line or a cell tower. His call went up to a satellite a few hundred miles above the Earth, hopped across a chain of 66 of them, and came back down to the ground. It worked, and it worked anywhere. A pole, an ocean, the middle of a desert. For the first time, a single phone could reach the entire surface of the planet. It had taken 11 years and more than $5 billion to build. 9 months later, the company that built it filed for bankruptcy, one of the 20 largest in American history to that point. This is not the story of a technology that failed. This is the story of a machine that worked perfectly, built by a company designed from the first contract to lose everyone's money but one. The story everyone tells starts on a beach. In 1985, an engineer at Motorola named Barry Bertiger was on holiday in the Caribbean. As he told it, his wife Karen, a real estate broker, was frustrated that she could not get a phone signal to reach her clients back home. Whether it happened exactly that way, we cannot know. Motorola's own official history skips the beach and dates the idea to 1987, credited to 3 engineers. So treat the beach as a story Bertiger told, not a fact on the record. The idea itself is not in dispute. Instead of building towers on the ground, one country at a time, you build the whole network in the sky. A ring of satellites in low orbit passing a call from one to the next, covering every point on Earth at the same moment. The plan called for 77 satellites. 77 is the atomic number of the element iridium, and that is the name that stuck. The engineers later cut the design to 66. By the joke of the periodic table, 66 is the element dysprosium, from the Greek for hard to get at. Nobody bothered to rename it. It was one of the most ambitious machines a private company had ever proposed to build, and Motorola decided it would build all of it, and run all of it, and own much of it. To understand why Iridium went bankrupt, you have to understand what Motorola was inside the deal. Because it was 4 things at once. It was the largest shareholder. It put in around $400 million for roughly a quarter of the company. It was the builder. Iridium signed a contract worth about $3.5 billion for Motorola to design, produce, and place the satellites in orbit. And if the finished system never worked at all, Motorola's liability was capped at $100 million. It was the operator. A second contract, worth about $2.9 billion, paid Motorola to run the system for 5 years after it was built. And it was the guarantor. When Iridium borrowed money, Motorola guaranteed some of the loans, and Iridium paid Motorola for that guarantee, at rates reaching almost 14% plus stock. Read that structure carefully because it is the whole story in one shape. Motorola made most of its money by building and running the system under fixed contracts, paid on a schedule. Whether Iridium ever signed up a single paying customer, those contracts got paid. The company that carried the risk of failure was Iridium. The company that collected the reward of construction was Motorola. On paper, they were the same project. In their incentives, they were opposites. This is not an accusation. Motorola took real losses too, and years later, when the creditors sued, Motorola won in court. Keep that in mind, but hold on to the shape, because everything that follows is that shape playing out. Somebody had to pay for the building. That money came from 3 places, and all 3 would be destroyed. First, the partners. Around the world, telecom companies and governments took equity stakes and agreed to run the local gateways. 19 members in all, from Italy to Russia to Korea. Together they put in billions. Second, the public. In June 1997, the venture went to the stock market and raised $240 million at $20 a share. Within a year, the stock traded above 68. Third, the lenders. Iridium sold about $1.5 billion of high-yield bonds at interest rates between roughly 11 and 14%, and arranged bank facilities on top of that. Add it all up, and the system cost well over $5 billion to build. Some estimates run close to 6. Every dollar of it was borrowed or raised against a single assumption, that once the satellites were up, the customers would come. And here is the trap in the numbers, so we do not double count. The 5 billion is what the system cost. The contracts to Motorola were worth about 6.5 billion on paper, but only part of that was ever paid. The debt at bankruptcy was over 4 billion. Those are 3 different numbers measuring 3 different things. Anyone who adds them together has understood nothing. The satellites went up. We should look at them because this is the part that went right. Here is the part that worked. 66 satellites in 6 orbital planes of 11, a little under 500 miles up, circling the Earth about once every 100 minutes. What made it extraordinary was that the satellites talked to each other. A call could hop from one satellite to the next across the sky before it ever came back down to the ground. No other commercial network in the world did this. Motorola built them on something close to a production line. At the peak, one satellite left the factory every 4 days. 95 were launched in total, across 22 launches, on American, Russian and Chinese rockets. And it delivered what it promised. A phone that worked at the North Pole, in the middle of the Pacific, in the deep desert. When the United States Department of Defense later described the system, it called it state-of-the-art. Judge the engineering honestly. It was a genuine triumph. 16 of the launched satellites failed to work, which for a constellation this size is inside the normal range. The engineers did not sink this company. The product did. And the moment you hold the actual product, the problem is obvious in about 3 seconds. The Iridium handset was the size of a brick and weighed about a pound. It cost around $3,000. A call cost several dollars a minute and on some routes far more. And because it talked to satellites in the sky, it needed a clear line to the sky. It did not work indoors. It did not work in a moving car. It struggled in a city between tall buildings. To use it, you often had to walk outside and hold it up to open air. The data rate was 2.4 kilobits a second, a figure designed in the 1980s for voice and hopeless for almost anything else. Iridium's own marketing director, seeing the handset for the first time, said, and this is a quote, "It's huge. It will scare people." None of this was a secret. It was all knowable years before launch. The phone was heavy because the physics of reaching a satellite made it heavy. It was expensive because the system underneath it had cost $5 billion. But by the time anyone was holding the finished handset, that $5 billion had already been committed, and the contracts to build it were already being paid. The design of the deal meant the money went out long before the verdict came in. Every one of these numbers had been forecast. That is the strange part. In 1990, Motorola's own consultants projected that by 2001, the system would have almost 7 million subscribers. At launch, the company said it needed around 500,000 customers to hit its targets and expected 5 million within a few years. Those forecasts were not stupid when they were written. They were written in the late 1980s, when a satellite was the only way to make a call from most of the planet. But Iridium took 11 years to get from idea to service. And in those 11 years, the ground moved. Ordinary cellular networks, GSM, spread across Europe, then reached China, then Brazil, then almost everywhere a business traveler actually went. A cheap phone in your pocket that worked inside a building beat a $3,000 brick that only worked outdoors every single time. The market Iridium had been built for, the traveler who simply could not get a signal, was shrinking at almost exactly the speed the satellites were going up. This is the deepest lesson in the whole story, and it has nothing to do with satellites. A forecast is a photograph of the present pointed at the future. Iridium spent 11 years and $5 billion answering a question that the world, very quietly, had already stopped asking. So here is what actually arrived. Commercial service began on the 1st of November 1998. By the end of that month, Iridium had around 3,000 subscribers. By the 31st of March 1999, a figure we know precisely because it is written into federal court opinion, it had 10,294. By August, around 20,000. Its loan agreements required 52,000. And here is the one detail that says everything. By the 1st of March 1999, Motorola had already manufactured more than 40,000 handsets. The company had built more phones than it had customers to use them. Meanwhile, the debt did not wait. The interest alone ran about $40 million a month on a business taking in a small fraction of that. A company can survive almost anything except running out of cash. And Iridium, the most advanced communication system ever built, a machine that could reach any point on Earth, was quietly and very quickly running out of cash. It came apart fast. On the 11th of August 1999, Iridium defaulted on more than $1.5 billion of loans. 2 days later, on Friday the 13th of August, it filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The same day, a group of its own bondholders filed a competing petition in New York trying to control what happened next. It was, at the time, one of the 20 largest bankruptcies in United States history. 9 months and 12 days after the vice president made that first call. The stock, which had traded above $68, was near $3. The bonds were changing hands at around 15 cents on the dollar. In March 2000, the company switched the service off. The satellites were still up there, still working. Still circling the Earth every 100 minutes. Now talking to no one. And then the story turned into the strangest question in it. Not who would rescue the company. The company was gone. The question was who had already won. Line the players up by what they walked away with. The public shareholders who put in $240 million at the IPO were wiped out. The bondholders owed $1.5 billion got pennies. The partners around the world lost most of what they had contributed. And Motorola? By the middle of 1999, Iridium had paid Motorola more than $3 billion under its construction and operating contracts, against an equity stake of about $400 million. Its operating contract alone charged Iridium around $45 million a month to run the system. After the bankruptcy, when new owners hired Boeing to run the very same satellites, Boeing did it for about $3.5 million a month, 92% less. Now be fair to Motorola because the record demands it. Motorola took real losses. It honored a $750 million loan guarantee. It wrote down close to $1 billion. And when the creditors later sued, alleging exactly the thing this beat is describing, a judge ruled for Motorola. And the case settled with Motorola paying nothing out of pocket. So this is not a story about a crime. It is a story about a structure. When one company is paid in advance on a fixed schedule to build a thing, and everyone else is paid only if the thing succeeds, you already know who will be left standing when the music stops. You knew it before a single satellite launched. The man running Iridium at the very end said it more honestly than any critic ever could. We're a classic MBA case study in how not to introduce a product. First, we created a marvelous technological achievement. Then we asked how to make money on it. What happened next to the satellites is almost hard to believe. With the company dead and no buyer in sight, Motorola prepared to bring the whole constellation down, to burn all 66 satellites up in the atmosphere. The software to do it had already been uploaded. One man involved later said it came down to a single button and a phone call that never came. Instead, at the last moment, an investor named Dan Colucci assembled a group and bought the entire system out of bankruptcy. Satellites, network, all of it. The price was $25 million. A system that had cost more than $5 billion to build sold for $25 million. About half a cent for every dollar that had been spent. And what saved it was a customer Motorola had once brushed aside. The United States military signed a contract for unlimited airtime for 20,000 government users. The satellites that had been minutes from deliberate destruction were switched back on. The machine had been right all along. It just belonged now to whoever had paid the least for it. So who was right? The engineers were right. The machine worked. It still works. The same idea, satellites talking to satellites, blanketing the whole Earth, is the basis of the networks going up above our heads right now. The forecasts were wrong, but not because the future never arrived. It arrived 11 years too late for the people who paid for it, and 11 years too early for the ones who bought it cheap. Because look at where that $25 million company went. It relaunched. It went public again. It replaced all 66 satellites with a brand new generation launched by SpaceX. Last year it earned more than $870 million, serving more than 2.5 million subscribers. And in June of 2026, the rocket company Rocket Lab agreed to buy it, in a deal that valued the business at around $8 billion. $8 billion for the same satellites in roughly the same orbits that were once sold for 25 million and that once for a few weeks were minutes away from being deliberately burned out of the sky. The technology was never the empire. The technology was real, and it survived everything. The empire was on paper. It was in the contracts, in the guarantees, in the order of who got paid and when. And the people who drew up the paper knew from the very first signature which side of it to stand on. That is what this series is about, not the machines. The paper.